This channel is part of the HistoryHit network.
In the early hours of the morning of June 6, 1944, the final preparations were being made for what would prove to be the greatest test of Allied strength in the whole of the Second World War. The Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy was the most dangerous operation undertaken, with Rommel waiting in France with a 32-division-strong German army. The selfless sacrifices made by the men and women of the invasion forces can never be forgotten. This is the story of their unrelenting efforts and of how the combined operations of the Normandy campaign would become the decisive turning point in determining the outcome of the greatest conflict of the 20th century. As commander of Allied 21st Army Group, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had the enormous responsibility of leading the forces on the ground during the Normandy campaign of 1944. Under his leadership in the Battle for Normandy, the Allies achieved all of their objectives. But in the intervening years, it has become almost fashionable to be critical of Montgomery and the British forces. Together, they have been criticized for lack of aggression, initiative and strategic flair.
Well, nothing in battle can ever be clear as to what's going to happen. It has to be a question of reacting to what the enemy did. And I think one of my father's great skills was that although he set out a plan, inevitably, as the battle developed, it had to be constantly altered depending on the circumstances.
The evidence from the time makes it abundantly clear that the British forces under Montgomery were playing their part in a very precise strategy for the campaign, which was outlined at a meeting of senior commanders in St. Paul's School, London, on May the 15th, 1944. It was intended that the 4 Allied corps which landed on the 5 beaches on D-Day would penetrate to a depth of about 10 kilometers inland and capture the towns of Bayeux and Caen. By D-Day +10, the Allies would have secured the line of high ground running from Saint-Lô to Villers-Bocage. While the British engaged the German forces in a battle which was intended to be fought south of Caen, it was planned that Patton's Third Army would expand southwards in a grand encircling movement designed to trap the German forces, and by D-Day +90, the Allies would be encamped along the River Seine and Paris would be in their hands.
When my father was asked to command Operation Overlord, his first move was to talk to Eisenhower in North Africa, and then go to Churchill to explain that the original plan to have a 3-division front would not work, and it needed to be expanded to a 5-division plan. And indeed, this was the plan that he launched when he got back to England at the beginning of January 1944.
The Allied plan for the Battle of Normandy was exceptionally sound and exceptionally safe, but it had to be. This battle absolutely had to succeed. If the Allies had been defeated on D-Day, if they'd been defeated in the Battle of Normandy, it is almost impossible to say what the future consequences would have been for the Second World War.
Present at the meeting at St. Paul's School, where Montgomery outlined his grand strategy for the campaign, were King George VI, Winston Churchill, and General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the West. Recalling the meeting some years after the event, the US General Omar Bradley was impressed by the selfless role which was assumed by the British forces.
The British and Canadian armies were to decoy the enemy reserves and draw them to their front on the extreme eastern edge of the Allied beachheads. While Monty taunted the enemy at Caen, we were to make our breakout on a long roundabout road to Paris, when reckoned in terms of national pride, this British decoy mission became a sacrificial one. For while we tramped around on the outside flank, the British were to sit in place and pin down the Germans. Yet strategically, it fitted into a logical division of labours, for it was towards Caen that enemy forces would race once the alarm was sounded.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. From the Battle of Trafalgar and the Revolutionary era, right through to the Second World War. If you are looking for your next military history fix, then this is the service for you. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and War Stories fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code WARSTORIES at checkout.
It's recorded now quite clearly that the Germans thought that the Normandy invasion might well have been a decoy operation in itself, and that the main thrust was still to come. So fortunately, they didn't move the big bulk of their forces down there until a bridgehead had been established.
Well, we marched through the front, round Bayeux. They were just building the road round Bayeux, the pioneers, and then we went into battle at the village of Cheux, where we were completely surprised by some German Panther tanks, which inflicted quite a few casualties on our battalion. And it so happened that my pal, who I'd palled up with from the Warwickshire Regiment, he was unfortunately killed in the first battle, so he never had a chance to fire a shot.
The British and Canadians, by persistently attacking on either side of Caen, posed the greatest threat of a breakout from Normandy. And the Germans always perceived this as the greatest danger. Now, as it happened, this produced the situation in which, with the German armour grouped against the British and the Canadians, the breakout came in the west from the Americans.
There can be few campaigns in the history of warfare which were as meticulously planned and so heavily insured against failure as the D-Day landings of 1944. The Anglo-American forces which stormed ashore on Hitler's fortress Europe enjoyed an overwhelming superiority in men, ammunition, ships, tanks, planes, and all the rest of the panoply of the war.
The 6th of June 1944 would see two considerable armed forces pitted against one another in the Normandy area. Something like 160,000 Allied troops in 3 airborne and 5 and a bit amphibiously landed infantry divisions were deployed in Normandy on the 6th of June against German defenders of varying quality, it should be said, but quite considerable numbers.
During the landings, and for up to 20 miles inland, the Allied forces could rely on the massive guns of the Allied battleships, which were capable of firing devastating barrages of heavy artillery fire against the German forces.
We were bombarding Normandy. We were anchored off Le Havre, and we were bombarding 20 miles inland. We were bombarding Caen, and we were being controlled gunnery-wise by a spotter plane doing the spotting for the gunnery officer on the bridge, who obviously could make the calculations for firing a shot 20 miles away.
Nelson was covering us and several other ships, dropping them short at the start, but we got away, well, some of us got away with it, you know.
Even for those Germans who had fought in Russia, naval gunfire proved to be a devastating experience, which was shocking in its intensity. The power of the heavy shells from the 16-inch guns of the battleships produced a barrage which was so intense that Tiger tanks, which weighed 56 tons, were flipped onto their sides like children's toys. In the opening days of the Normandy campaign, the Allies could rely upon the support of 9 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 73 destroyers.
The Royal Navy's role on the 6th of June 1944, and indeed for several months afterwards, was absolutely indispensable to the success of Operation Overlord. Something like 80% of the thousands of vessels that were used during Operation Neptune were in fact crewed by British personnel.
The amphibious landings of D-Day were mounted from Britain, and they were very much a British operation. Just under 4 out of every 5 of the ships involved in the operation were either British Royal Navy or they belonged to the navies of the various Dominion and Imperial fleets.
This vast assemblage had been brought to bear against an enemy which in many respects was already on the brink of defeat. At sea, the Kriegsmarine could do almost nothing to impede the Allied fleet. Of 45 German U-boats ordered to strike at the Allied fleet, 30 were sunk, with only minimal losses in the D-Day Armada.
Already before D-Day, the Allies had secured control of the English Channel, or the invasion could not have taken place. And the German naval response to D-Day itself was absolutely ineffective. Of their 2 fleets of light craft, the Cherbourg flotillas could not come out to sea because of the very bad weather conditions, which of course affected the Allied landings as well. In the east, a small number of what the Germans called S-boats or Schnellbooten, which are light torpedo craft, did actually come out from Le Havre, but they were driven off by British destroyers. So effectively, there was no German naval response to D-Day.
On land, the situation for the Germans was, if anything, worse. 4 years of savage warfare in Russia had drained the strength of the German army away. For the duration of the Normandy campaign, only 20% of the available German forces could be committed to the war in the West. The remaining 80% had to be split between the 5% needed to defend German territory in Italy and the 75% which were always required to prevent the Russians from achieving a strategic victory in the East.
Between 1941 and 1945, something like 80% of the Wehrmacht's losses were incurred on the Eastern Front, and of course huge numbers of German forces were tied down on that front. Nevertheless, for the Allied servicemen in Normandy, to deny the reality of their experience would quite clearly be nonsense. It was a pretty real war for them too. Furthermore, the attack on Normandy really created a major problem with which the Germans were incapable of dealing, i.e. a multi-front war.
The Russians, don't forget, had been trying to insist that the British mount a second front for some years. As early as 1942, there was no way the Allies could have mounted an invasion across Channel until they were absolutely prepared. And I think it's almost very important to understand that the invasion of Northwest Europe in June 1944 was the biggest single operation in the whole history of warfare.
One of the great successes of the Normandy campaign was the secrecy with which the whole operation was shrouded. The Germans were completely deceived as to the place and date of the landings right up to the moment the first troops came ashore.
Didn't even know where you were going. You knew you were going somewhere in France because they paid us out in French francs in these camps that they put us all in before D-Day. And they penned us all up before D-Day, all along the south coast. And we weren't allowed to go out to tell anyone, where we were going. They paid us with these little paper money, special invasion money. And most of the lads in the camp had nothing else to do, so we were playing cards. And so we most of us lost our money, so it was special money for the invasion, you know.
The Allies enjoyed the benefits of a steady flow of accurate information on enemy dispositions, which came from the highly efficient Allied spy network, and from the eager efforts of the French resistance, who constantly monitored the German troop movements and passed detailed information on to London. In the air, the Allies had an even greater advantage. On D-Day itself, 5,000 Allied fighters filled the sky and swept away the 119 German fighters which opposed them. With the air superiority of 50 to 1, rocket-firing typhoons of the Allied Air Force had a field day, combing the terrain behind the Normandy beaches for any sign of movement on the ground. By midday on June the 6th, 1944, Allied fighters were completely unopposed, and in many instances the pilots could no longer find a target. In some cases, there was competition between the Allied fighters to attack the German vehicles which were foolhardy enough to venture onto the roads.
The Allies had absolute control of the air for the Battle of Normandy. From April 1944, they'd been conducting bombing raids against targets in France, such as railway marshalling yards and bridges, forcing the Germans to commit their fighters to defend these targets, and then engaging fighter to fighter in order to destroy the German forces. So that by the time the Battle of Normandy takes place, the Allies have virtually complete control of the air.
This complete, virtually, air supremacy was put to extremely good use during the Battle of Normandy. Allied bombers could reduce German beach defences, Allied bombers could cut German lines of communication, thus paralysing the build-up of German forces opposite the amphibiously and airborne landing British and American forces, and of course tactical air support could create absolute havoc for any German unit in Normandy foolish enough to try to move its strength by day.
Newsreels of the period show German vehicles covered in branches in an attempt to disguise any vehicle movements from the air. The crew constantly scanned the horizon for the first signs of the British fighter bombers, which made any movement on the ground an extremely hazardous undertaking. After the war, Fritz Bayerlein and the commander of the Panzerlehrdivision recorded the effects of the Allied air attacks. General Bayerlein, like all the other divisional commanders on the ground, knew that in the face of Allied air superiority, it was almost suicidal to move during the day. Nonetheless, in their desire to rush as many troops into battle as quickly as possible, the German High Command proved to be stubbornly inflexible, as Bayerlein bitterly recalled.
At 2 o'clock in the morning of 6th of June, I was alerted that the invasion fleet was coming across the channel. I was told to begin moving north that afternoon at 5 o'clock. Well, this was too early. Air attacks had been severe in the daylight, and everyone knew that everything that could fly would support the invasion. My request for a delay until twilight was refused. So we moved as ordered, and immediately came under Allied air attack. I lost 20 or 30 vehicles by nightfall. At daylight next morning, the commander of the 7th Army gave me a direct order to proceed, and there was nothing else I could do, so the vehicles moved off, as ordered. By the end of the day, I had lost 40 trucks and 90 others. 5 of my tanks were knocked out, and 84 half-tracks, prime movers, and self-propelled guns. These were serious losses for a division not yet in action.
On the German side, the Allied air superiority was just one of a number of serious disadvantages which had to be overcome if they were to conduct a successful campaign in Normandy. Chief among these was the confusion and disorganization which prevailed in the chain of command. As Supreme Commander, Adolf Hitler constantly dabbled in every aspect of the forces at his command, and he had a habit of reserving particularly powerful formations for his personal control. The situation in France was a particularly complicated one. The nominal commander-in-chief was von Rundstedt, who controlled Army Group B, responsible for northern France and Belgium, and Army Group G, which was responsible for southern France. But Rommel, who was in command of Army Group B, enjoyed the favor of Hitler, and in practice could not be overruled by his superior. To further compound matters, 3 of the panzer divisions operating within Rommel's area of influence were allocated to a separate formation, known as Panzer Group West. This powerful grouping was designated as an army reserve and could only be deployed on the express authority of Hitler himself. This complicated and divisive policy was a result of Hitler's mistrust of the generals, and there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that the divide and rule policy was a deliberate stratagem on Hitler's part.
Adolf Hitler believed in struggle, that the strongest man, the strongest beast, would emerge from a natural process of struggle, and he organized the Nazi state that way, so that the German command structure is not set up to cooperate with itself. It is set up as a series of competing structures which are meant to fight each other. And they did this so well that they defeated themselves as well as the Allies defeating them in Normandy.
Certainly Army, Waffen-SS, Navy and Luftwaffe units all operated within different and often contradictory or competing command structures, and this certainly made the Germans' prosecution of any successful counter-attack or counter-offensive once the Allies landed in Normandy much less likely to succeed.
By 1944, the flaws which affected the High Command were also reflected in the declining quality of the men in the ranks. The steady war of attrition in Russia meant that the Wehrmacht had to accept lower and lower standards of physical fitness for new recruits. Men who would previously have been refused for the armed services had to be called into action. One famous example is the Stomach Battalion, which was filled with middle-aged men who had stomach complaints and therefore required a special diet. At the other end of the spectrum from the aging warriors of the Stomach Battalions, the German army also had to allow the deployment of the 12th SS Panzer Division, better known as the Hitler Youth Division. This division was led by experienced officers drawn from the famous SS Leibstandarte Division. But the ranks were filled almost entirely by teenagers. The average age of the division was just 18. Although the Hitler Youth Division fought with enormous courage and ferocity in the coming battle, the mere fact that it was now necessary to deploy a division comprised of schoolboys meant that the end was clearly in sight for the German army.
I was sent to Normandy about 3 weeks after D-Day, and it really was pretty horrific. I was put on a men's surgical ward in the Marquis, and the conditions were dreadful. Gradually we were getting a great number of German prisoners of war back to the hospital. Very sad to see these young German prisoners of war, boys of about 16, coming in with gangrenous feet and having amputation. It seemed very wicked, and they were so badly wounded.
Anybody in German high authority in late 1943, early 1944, knew perfectly well that the Second World War was lost. To take these 18-year-old boys full of ideological spirit, and to commit them to die in Normandy against the Allies was an act of almost grotesque barbarism.
The overwhelming demands of a war on three fronts posed a host of additional problems for the German logistics and supply system. Allied fighters and fighter bombers had not restricted their attacks just to the troops on the ground. They also carried out a massive air and interdiction campaign against the German supply lines. Roads and railway lines were mercilessly targeted, which meant that supplies of essential fuel and ammunition stocks could not reach the hard-pressed front line. By this stage of the war, Germany was under constant attack by Allied bomber formations, and fuel was already in very short supply. In Normandy, fuel shortages became almost endemic, and in many cases, German tanks which were needed urgently to resist the invasion could not move through lack of fuel. The ceaseless Allied attacks on the long columns of fuel lorries only served to compound these problems. To offset many disadvantages which faced the German troops fighting on the ground in Normandy, they did enjoy some real advantages over the Allies. Many of the panzer divisions which would be used to face the Allies had a strong core of battle-hardened, experienced troops who had already seen 4 years of brutal warfare. This experience gave them the mental toughness which would serve them in great stead during the coming battle.
The battle experience of the German forces in Normandy varied dramatically between formation. Some units, for example the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, were extremely experienced and battle-hardened and indeed well equipped. Others, for example the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, were very well equipped but utterly inexperienced. Many of the German divisions, of course, fell somewhere in between these two.
Well, German forces had had a great deal of battle experience. I mean, they had fought very professionally on both fronts for a very long time. So indeed had the British. The interesting, I think, aspect of this is that the American forces, who played such a vital part, of course had much less battle experience, which I always feel is probably one of the reasons why my father assigned them the breakout role rather than the holding role in the initial stages of the operation.
The German forces also enjoyed a very real superiority in the quality of their tank forces. Not only were the crews hugely experienced and battle-hardened by years on the Russian front, the tanks themselves were far better than those used by the Allies. In particular, the Tiger, Panther, and the new King Tiger tanks could all engage Allied tanks at much longer ranges than those at which the Allies could fight back. The superior armour of the tanks also gave the Germans a marked advantage in battle. Time and time again, Allied tank soldiers described that disheartening experience of seeing their own shells bounce off the armour of the German tanks. This disparity in quality was to have a very real impact on the coming battles.
An officer came and said, there's a tank alarm. He said, there are 3 tanks advancing towards us. And he said, we want Piats. So he said, you've got one, so he said, you can have the one coming up the centre. So I found myself a position and positioned me and waited for this tank to come up the centre. Well, a tank did come up. It was a Tiger tank, a huge thing. So I said, right to the loader, come on, this is our target. We'll get this fella. And so the loader came up and loaded the Piat, and I fired about 4 shots at him. It didn't seem to make much impression, but on the 5th shot, the loader's hands were shaking, and he didn't get it loaded in properly. And so I had to get up from my position, load it, before I could get back again to fire it. And the tank spotted me, turned his gun straight round at me, an 88mm gun, fired it at the same time that I fired at him. And there was the enormous flash, and then I was wounded as the shell landed on my left side.
I feel throughout the entire war that we were generally always fighting with inferior equipment. And I think this is one of the demonstrations of the skill of both the Allied command and the qualities of the British soldier, that despite the fact that we had inferior equipment in many cases, that we were able to succeed.
The actual events of the D-Day landings themselves have little impact on our story. Save to say that most of the Allied objectives were achieved on that crucial first day, with one major exception: the capture of Caen. The city, which should have been in Allied hands by the end of D-Day +1, was to remain in German hands until July the 18th, 6 weeks after the beginning of the battle. The reasons for the successful defence of Caen was the extremely difficult nature of the bocage country in which the campaign was fought. The bocage was a closely packed area of narrow lanes and high-banked hedgerows, enclosing small fields and sunken lanes. It proved to be ideal defensive terrain, where anti-tank guns and machine gun nests could be concealed until the last possible moment. The Allies had the advantage in numbers of tanks, but in the claustrophobic world of the bocage, anti-tank teams could get close enough to the tanks to attack them at murderously close range. This German newsreel footage, taken by a war reporter in the front line, shows the German grenadiers stalking Allied tanks. First of all, they allowed the leading Sherman tanks in the Allied column to pass their position before the move to destroy a fourth vehicle. It is very rare to see both sides in the same picture from World War II, and the sequence gives a real idea of just how close the two sides actually were to each other in the close combat in the bocage. In this difficult environment, the advantage was with the defender, and the bocage soon became known to the Allies as the Green Hell.
It was absolutely horrific, the Normandy. Absolutely horrific. You know, when you're young and you're trying for it, you expect it to a certain extent. You know, you've got your duty to do anyway. So, you know, you just got to get on with it.
Most of the Normandy countryside was a rather beautiful natural checkerboard of fields marked with high earth banks topped with hedges, and this formed a natural trench system with communication ditches running along the main length of the fields. The hedgerow country, or in French the bocage, was a formidable aid to the Germans in their defence. The British were losing infantry at about the same rate in Normandy as they had on the Somme or at Passchendaele in the First World War.
Faced with their inability to take the remaining objective from D-Day, the British High Command had no alternative to fighting in the bocage. As casualties steadily mounted, the airfield at Carpiquet on the outskirts of Caen became a vital target. It was tenaciously defended by the youngsters of the Hitler Youth Division against a series of assaults by superior British forces. These youngsters were disdainful of the traditions of the established SS divisions of the German army, and for their divisional symbol, they adopted the German runics, but arrogantly placed it over the key symbol of the veteran SS Leibstandarte division in a challenge to the experienced members of the most senior SS division, who now knew that they had a younger rival for the mantle of the Third Reich's leading fighting formation. The Hitler Youth Division performed very well in battle, but the High Command must have taken a dim view of their habit of painting their girlfriends' names on their tanks, in preference to the approved divisional numbering. Under incredibly difficult circumstances, the Hitler Youth Division fought so well that their commanders had little choice but to turn a blind eye to this breach of the regulations. In an attempt to outflank the stubborn defenders at Carpiquet, Montgomery dispatched his highly experienced 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, to make a broad sweep south of Caen, which was scheduled to begin on June the 12th. The attack was aimed at the small town of Villers-Bocage, and it was here that one of the most famous tank actions of the war would be fought. The Allied spearhead was halted and almost single-handedly destroyed in a fierce battle through the streets and fields surrounding Villers-Bocage by German Tiger tanks of the 101st Heavy Battalion, led by the famous tank commander Michael Wittmann.
At Villers-Bocage, the British were looking for a quick and relatively cheap way round to the south to free Caen. They were taking a risk. Wars are won and battles are won by taking risks. On this occasion, the risk didn't work.
In a single day, the British forces lost over 60 tanks and a huge number of accompanying vehicles. By nightfall on July the 13th, Villers-Bocage was back in German hands.
The defeat of the 7th Armoured Division at Villers-Bocage represented really the loss of the last real opportunity to make the battle for Normandy the mobile battle which the Allied planners hoped and indeed expected that it would be.
During the last 3 weeks of June, as British casualties climbed, Montgomery knew that something had to be done to break the stalemate around Caen. His answer was Operation Epsom, which was launched on the 26th of June 1944. It began with a massive Allied artillery bombardment, which pounded the enemy defences around the airfield. On the receiving end were units from 3 panzer divisions, the Hitler Youth Division, who was still holding out around the Carpiquet airfield, the 21st Division, which had been reformed from survivors of North Africa, and the elite Panzer Lehr Division. Despite the incredible bombardments, these 3 divisions held their ground, and the 15th Scottish Infantry Division was badly mauled in the fighting. The Epsom offensive ground to a halt less than 4 miles from the British start line. But there was even worse to come. Anticipating German reinforcements, Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey, the commander of the British Second Army, withdrew from even the small gains which had been achieved.
We went into Hill 112 with about 600 men. The Germans retreated off the hill, and myself and about 20 others managed to get right to the top of the brow of the hill so that we could overlook the German lines. And we remained there for 3 days. And we kept wondering why there was no water, food or ammunition coming to us. And so we thought we were fed up with the stony ground and we couldn't get proper cover because we'd been shelled by the Tiger tanks. So we thought we'd try and find softer ground to get deeper trenches. We'd been lying in a ditch by the hedge, and we went round the hedge, and I said, "Hey, look, fellas, there's one trench here already dug for us." So I said, "But before we go down, we'll fire some shots into that and make sure it's clean, you see." So I fired 3 shots from the Bren gun that I'd got with me, and out came 6 Germans with their hands up. So we sent the prisoners back, and then behind us they realised that if we'd sent prisoners back, we must be somebody there. So they sent a runner in and said, "What are you fellas doing here? The order to retreat was given 2 days ago."
Operation Epsom was abandoned with Caen still in German hands. With the failure of Operation Epsom, Montgomery decided that it was now time to take a sledgehammer to Caen, which was to be attacked and captured in a frontal assault codenamed Operation Charnwood, which was scheduled for July the 8th. Until the Allies could break out past Caen, the beachhead would continue to be jammed with men and supplies who were unable to move inland and highly vulnerable to counterattack. More importantly, the British had yet to capture an airfield. The one at Carpiquet was still in German hands. Charnwood was meant to provide a quick and brutal solution to the problems, but the sheer scale of the operation and the overwhelming level of backup support available to Montgomery actually worked against the British forces. To soften up the German defenders, no less than 467 British and Canadian bombers were allocated to attack the town prior to the offensive. This total disregard for the lives of their civilian allies caused 10,000 casualties amongst the innocent civilian population of Caen. More importantly, it created a wilderness of rubble similar to that which had appeared after the Allied bombing at Monte Cassino in 1943. The huge bomb craters and acres of rubble produced a ready-made series of impenetrable defenses. For the men who had seen action in Stalingrad and Cassino, the ruins of Caen provided a heaven-sent opportunity for men who knew from bitter experience exactly how to defend ruined cities. Once again, the attack had to be called off in the face of huge British casualties. But this time, there was at least one glimmer of consolation. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles had finally succeeded in capturing the airstrip at Carpiquet and eliminating the garrison from the Hitler Youth Division.
Operation Charnwood was successful in the sense that the northern part of Caen was captured, and to describe it as a failure is therefore again unfair. Having said that, Operation Charnwood was again something of a mismanaged battle from the British point of view. The German defences were not really hit by the British and American bombing for the simple reason that fear of dropping bombs on British and Canadian forces meant that the bomb line was pushed far to the south of the German positions.
Despite this moderate success, Montgomery was now the recipient of some worrying news from London. The enormous casualty rate around Caen was draining away the British replacements, and if the loss rate continued at its present level, replacements would run out at the end of July. It was against this background that Montgomery decided to try one last offensive. Designed to capture the territory south of Caen, it was codenamed Operation Goodwood and scheduled for the 17th of July. Operation Goodwood was a massive attack involving all 4 British and Canadian corps in Normandy. There were so many troops involved that there was a day's delay while all the necessary men and vehicles were brought into position, but hopes ran high that the war of attrition had finally turned in the British favour. Goodwood began with an overwhelming air, naval and artillery bombardment designed to blast a path for 750 tanks to advance towards the high ground south of Caen. Once again, their opponents were to be men of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, many of whom had been in action since June the 8th. In the steady war of attrition, the SS Corps had been reduced to a strength of just 100 tanks, but they could still command deep defensive positions of the bocage, and they were backed up with the deadly 88mm anti-tank guns. The opening Allied barrage was so intensive, it was described by some German veterans as the biggest and most intense artillery bombardment they had ever witnessed, even in Russia. There are accounts of Tiger tanks being thrown into the air. Under this intense storm of steel, men went mad and had to be committed to mental hospitals. And there are at least 2 documented cases of German soldiers who committed suicide rather than endure the bombardment any longer. Despite massive preparations which were made, Goodwood was an even greater failure than the previous offensives. Although the southern sector of Caen was cleared of the enemy, the Allies lost 200 tanks in a single day as they tried to cross the Orne. Fighting for Caen continued until July the 20th, but once again the operation had to be postponed, with parts of the city still in German hands.
Operation Goodwood is perhaps the most controversial of all of Montgomery's battles during the Normandy campaign. Measuring its success or failure really depends on what you believe Operation Goodwood was intended to achieve. If, for example, you believe what some people believe, that the attack was supposed to be a breakthrough attack, then quite clearly it failed to do that.
Montgomery, with hindsight, would claim that the deliberate intention of this attack was to tie down the last of the German armoured reserves against British Second Army, so enabling US First Army to break out on the 25th in Operation Cobra.
Despite all the British had done, Operation Cobra still faced some tough fighting before the American forces were finally able to break out of the bocage and sweep southwards into open country. As the American offensive began to gather pace, the British forces took advantage of the confusion in the German ranks to form the northern pincer in this huge encircling movement, which was designed to trap the German forces in Normandy in a huge pocket centred on the town of Falaise. As always, the 1st SS Panzer Corps continued to resist every step of the way, and they inflicted a severe reverse on the 1st Polish Armoured Division on August the 9th, and the Poles lost 150 tanks. In the face of continued resistance, the British forces kept up the drive southwards, and by August the 20th, they had linked up with the American forces to close a ring around Falaise. Although 40,000 German troops had managed to escape before the pocket was closed, 60,000 remained trapped inside, along with the bulk of the German armour. It was now that the Allied Air Force swept in for the kill. Led by squadron after squadron of rocket-firing Typhoons, they pounded the densely packed columns of German troops as they struggled to free themselves from the Allied trap. The scene of carnage in the retreating columns is almost impossible to describe, and 10,000 Germans died in the incessant air attacks. 50,000 more were taken prisoner.
We was up at Caen, and we watched one of the biggest air raids what was ever made on the Falaise forest. At night time, it was a artillery barrage bombing this or shelling this forest. And at daytime, I looked outside about 6 in the morning, and in the distance, it looked just like a lot of crows coming towards us. There was absolutely hundreds and hundreds of 4- and 2-inch bombers and fighter escorts coming over, and we stood and watched the bombs drop out. And this went on for 12 hours continually. We went up with the Canadians then to go to support those, and the people came out alive. Now, how they ever came out alive, we don't know.
These men represented the remains of 40 German divisions which had been destroyed in the battle for Normandy. 4/5 of the German army which had been committed to the campaign in Normandy had been destroyed. Montgomery had won his battle and, exactly as planned, the Allies were on the River Seine by D-Day +90.